And see, when this community collapsed in Oregon, because I was doing much work in Seattle at that time, for 2 to 3 years, all I was seeing was the fallout from this community. People who had truly believed, sincerely believed. And then suddenly the disillusionment. That's also a reality in a spiritual state. And they were just crushed. How could this be? And all the counseling work that had to come. In so many ways, to deprogram. So, there's always going to be a downfall. Yeah.
Have you been there?
Was I ever there? No. Then I would never go there. I knew better. See, for myself, I've lived in traditional monasteries. Traditional. Things that have been in place for 4,000 or 5,000 years. There's a fundamental difference between this and somebody presenting this. I mean, there's obviously a difference between a Yogananda and a Rajneesh, or a Christ and a Rajneesh. So this finally leads into the last stage. And in this stage, you begin to have a true degree of God realization. There are 7 stages in such realization, by the way. And as you finally move into the last stage, you begin to have such realization, which progressively evolves, and you transfer from the first part of this stage and the sincere desire to be of service to a larger whole. The teaching now becomes one of karma yoga. Karma yoga, meaning the work vehicle is actually a vehicle through which you spiritualize. How? Why? The Godhead is working through you in such work. And in this way, the ego is realigned from the personality and is now defined in the context of its own creation. And it progressively goes all the way up into moving from spiritual teacher to guru to avatar. The difference between a guru and avatar is what? The teachings of a guru only affect a certain amount of people for a certain amount of time. An avatar's teachings survive their own life for thousands of years and continually affect more and more people over those thousands of years. As in Jesus, Buddha, Latsu, Ramakrishna, and so on. Natural stages in evolution. The last state is simply the state of what I call dimly evolved, meaning souls evolving into human consciousness from other forms of life. 5% or so of this state. These people are characterized by a very dim sense of self-awareness, a basic sense of occupying time-space. There's 2 types in this condition. In fact, the words you will know in modern society to describe this state are things like mental retardation, cretinism, the Mongoloid syndrome, and the like. Now, there's 2 types in this condition. One type is a type that is, in fact, just evolving into this form of consciousness. And these people, when you look in their eyes, will have kind of a film over the pupil. Film. And they will be quite happy. Innocently happy. Why? They know no other experience. And the other type are souls being regressed through karmic calls into this condition. And the difference is you will see a white point of light coming from the pupil when you look in the eye. And these people will be, in varying degrees, very angry, to the point of being self-destructive. Why? They know different. And they are now experiencing the limitation of this condition. So these are the 4 natural evolutionary states. And you have to understand these states to understand the chart correctly. A Venus in Virgo in the 9th house is orientated to and actualized differently in a consensus state person than in an individuated state or spiritual state or dimly evolved state. And you cannot look at the piece of paper and know who's who. You have to do traditional astrology. Correlation, observation. The very first thing I do when a client comes to me is, what do you want? What do you want to know? What questions do you have? The very nature of their words will tell you at what evolutionary condition they are at. If I have a person coming to me and says, when can I expect my BMW? And the next one comes to me, when can I expect enlightenment? There's an observed difference. Any other questions?
You discussed Pluto retrograde.
Yes.
How about Pluto stationary?
Yeah, on the
Can you
question.
tell something about that?
I mean, when it's not retrograde?
Pardon?
When you mean when it's not retrograde?
When it is stationary, so it...
Yes, but it can be stationary direct or
Yes.
stationary retrograde.
Yeah, both. Could you tell something?
It magnifies the power of the condition. If it's stationary retrograde, it's like creating a double power on the retrograde archetype.
So it's an increased effect of retrogradation.
Mm-hmm.
In both cases, forward and backward.
Yeah.
I see.
Because from the point, if we look out into the sky, it is standing still there for a minute. Yeah? It's like to boom. Oh. Any other question? It's been a long trip. We've already been on the road a long time. Okay, what I want to discuss now are exceptions to the happy rules. So now you have this little happy list of procedures, and now we have to make some exceptions, and these exceptions in fact reflect life. So as an example, in the condition you can have as an example Pluto conjunct South Node. You can have Pluto conjunct North Node. You can have Pluto square the nodal axis. You can have the planetary ruler of the North Node conjunct South Node and the planetary ruler of South Node on North Node. There's different variations here. And so, when you find Pluto on South Node, one of three evolutionary karmic conditions exist, the two of which will be extreme, not common, and the last of which will be quite common. The first condition is a situation wherein the soul has simply resisted the evolutionary intentions reflected in this house and sign of the Pluto South Node condition, and the related issues that are reflected in the planetary ruler of that South Node was located by house and sign. Refused, resisted, not done. And therefore, in a karmic situation, it's a situation in this life in which the person is virtually forced to relive past life issues, dynamics, circumstances, and so on, in this life.
You're talking about Pluto conjunct South Node?
Yes, to relive. And here stands the North Node, yes? And this person will be extremely frustrated because they will sense in a kind of wistful way, in a nebulous way, a way out of these conditions. But because they have in fact resisted from past life, are now in a karmic situation and been literally forced to relive those conditions this life, and thus are blocked from the actualization of this North Node. Most people coming into any given life begin to become aware and thus to act upon the evolutionary intentions and lessons of roughly around the first Saturn return. In this particular situation, they are karmically blocked, generally speaking, until the second Saturn return, which is going to characterize most of the life. The second situation is a situation wherein the soul has so thoroughly developed the issues, the dynamics, the conditions, and so on, reflected in the house inside of the Pluto South Node and the location of his planetary ruler, and the motives have been sufficiently honest or pure that they are in a situation of karmic evolutionary fruition. Fruition. They are bringing something special from past life into this life. And this person can be just as frustrated. They still want a way out. Why? They've already been doing this enough. They want to try something else. And in these conditions, there will always be a karmic signature that shows you why they are in this situation. This can also happen sometimes when you find the Sun conjunct the South Node. Meaning the current life purpose, Sun, is to bring something back from the past, South Node.
The Sun and the North Node you're speaking about now?
No, I'm saying Sun conjunct South Node.
And if the Sun is the ruler of the South Node, it's the same?
It can have this meaning, yes.
Yes.
The third condition is most common, to have an element of relive from a karmic view, reliving past life conditions that were resisted, and also an element of fruition. This is the most common reaction. Not too many people completely resist. This is not the common experience. Now also when you find planet or planets on South Node, this can also implicate one of these three conditions. As an example, in my very last life, I died in a situation of anger. Complete anger. As a little Indian boy killed by white people. So with a gunshot. So I died with anger. And died with anger at white people. And sure enough, Mars stands on my South Node. One of the very first things my mother told me I tried to do was rip my skin off. Mars on South Node. So I've clearly had lessons in this life that pertain to the nature of anger. Yes, hand back here. I can't hear. Synastry? One of these three conditions will exist between those two people as a unit. As a unit. It's a mutual karma. Combined karma.
What if the Moon is on the South Node and Saturn on the North Node?
Saturn on South Node in this case. One of those three conditions will be operative. I can't tell you which, the person's not in front of me. And the planet on the North Node, and prior to this life, has been working to break free those issues from the past. It's a lesson in progress. In fact, when you find a planet on North Node, it tends to decrease the amount of time necessary in those reliving situations. Typically, around the first Saturn square after the first Saturn square, around 36.
So it's accelerating?
Hmm?
You're saying if there's a planet in conjunction with the North Node,
Yeah.
is it accelerating the process?
Yes, because it's occurred prior to this life. Now, when you find Pluto on North Node, this is a situation where that particular soul has been already working in this area of evolutionary metamorphosis prior to this life. And is meant to continue completely in this direction in this life. There's no polarity point.
And the same is true for the North Node in the 8th house? Would you say that?
If Pluto stands on it.
if the North Node is in the 8th house?
No.
That, no, it's
No.
different.
No. Yeah. Yes, yes.
Does it apply also if it's the same house and sign, but not
It means that that's becoming close to being true. But it typically reflects as a gestational awareness prior to the life being lived. I can't hear you.
the polarity point is that's applies that still. If the North Node and Pluto are the same house and sign, or not from none, does the polarity point still?
There's still an implication that has to go back and forth. It's like a seesaw. Meaning there's still certain issues from the past that have not been clarified or thoroughly worked through. It's getting close to be.
The planetary ruler of the North Node going into the South.
We're getting there, please. Be patient. Now we have Pluto standing in square to the nodal axis. In evolutionary terms, this is called skipped steps. Skipped steps. Meaning the soul has been going back and forth, between the issues, conditions, circumstances, and so on, that are symbolized in both nodes, the houses, the signs, and the planetary rulers, by their own house and sign locality aspects for making the person's been flip-flopping back and forth without completely developing either issue. They've been skipping steps. So that when you see this particular symbolism, it means in evolutionary terms they are karmically and evolutionarily required to recover those skipped steps before the future can truly be born, the new cycles. And the issue really, because in this case you have polarity point. And so one of the related issues is what? If this person's been flip-flopping, you're looking at a lack of integration. You're looking at two dynamics in their consciousness which are held in opposition, which are not integrated. And so the issue is also to achieve integration. So how to understand this problem, i.e. which node serves as the integration point that allows the polarity point and the skip steps to be recovered and move forwards. The way to answer this question is simply determined by understanding which node last formed a conjunction to Pluto, keeping in mind the mean motion of the nodes is retrograde. So as an example, if I have Pluto standing at 5 Leo, South node standing at 5 Taurus, North node standing at 5 Scorpio, which node last formed a conjunction with Pluto? It would be the North node in Scorpio. This will also hold true when you find planets, any planet, square the nodal axis of the moon. You still have the dynamic of skipped steps. You still have the karmic evolutionary requirement of having to recover something from the past. You still have the issue of what is going to be applied to create consistent integration. And again, you want to be looking to the node that last formed in conjunction to the whatever the planet may be. These are unique conditions. You can have a situation wherein the planetary ruler of the North Node is in fact conjunct the South Node and vice versa. You have a situation here where the past feels like the future and the future feels like the past, that are being perpetually recycled. It's like being in a closed loop. But in this case, you're going to have a polarity point relative to Pluto. So, what does it mean? It means that as the future and the past are recycled, They always meet at some point where the past and the future stands in the same moment. And a person is given a choice to break free from this cycle at that moment. And to break free is determined, seen through the polarity point of Pluto. And yet the person in this condition has to make a conscious effort to develop this point in order to break the loop. It will not happen of itself. So now think if you had this tool of astrology, and that kind of person came to you, all you've got to do is develop language/strategies to reflect this polarity point. And then tell the person, hey, you just have to make conscious choice. Typically in this kind of situation, the person will carry the psychology of victimization, feeling powerless to change anything. That somehow circumstances are larger than themselves. Yes? And so, any questions on these points? Clear?
No, not really. May I ask you again about what you told us just now about planetary rulers? For example, the ruler of the South Node conjunct the North Node.
Oh.
I didn't understand completely.
And does your question also mean the planetary ruler of the North Node's on South Node, or just that the South Node rulers on the North Node?
The last one.
The last one. That they're bringing conditions from the past into this life in order to complete them. To complete them. Typically this person will have as an actual experience a sense of having two lifetimes in one. Where in the first part of the life they more or less are hypnotically fulfilling conditions from the past. It comes to culmination, and boom, they begin a new cycle. Mm-hmm.
A general question on aspects out of sign but still within order in this respect. What is your opinion on that?
You have two archetypes to integrate. There's two different dynamics that are involved.
What about the ruler of the North and the South Node being conjunct?
Conjunct?
Yeah,
Yes, where?
in Leo, 6th house.
And these are not in direct aspect to the nodal axis.
No.
Okay, her question is, what happens when you have the planetary rulers of the South and North nodes conjunct, but are not themselves an aspect to the nodal axis? Here again you have a situation because of the conjunction, that the past and future are coming together. Yes? This same sense of recycling, because they're conjunct. What you now have to determine is if it's a balsamic conjunction, like yesterday, or a new phase conjunction. They put it now in the context of this archetypical understanding. If it's in balsamic, then you see the whole issue of culmination. Culmination.
This is balsamic,
Yeah. So it's a total culmination of an entire cycle that's preceded the current life in this life.
Is it possible that you can feel this very strong? Because at this very moment Pluto is also conjunct my South Node.
Yes, of course. This would be clearly one of the timing vehicles. Yeah. That's right. And in that situation, you would have an increasing sense that the whole cycle of your life and or any of the past life, which has been subconsciously conditioning, is now culminating. And within this sense, you will have an increasing sense of urgency, undefined urgency, emanating from the psyche, to make fundamental change, not fine-tuning. And as this begins, the awareness of what to do will not be there. It'll just be this great inner urgency, sort of like a feeling of having a hand grenade in that steel box. And of course, in the last analysis, the hand grenade will win in such a way as to completely create new structure. It's an exciting time.
Sometimes feels like a volcano.
Yes, of course, Pluto. And see, one of the temptations I might add in this is to leap forwards too quickly. And one of the intentions, unless you want to have Pluto in South Node next life, is to take care of anything that can be characterized as loose ends from that prior cycle. Even when the temptation says, I'm done with it, I don't want to hear about it, you've got to complete these loose ends. So that this new cycle is now contaminated, Pluto, from the past cycle. Now. Hello. Any more questions? So now let's examine the 4 ways that Pluto affects its evolutionary karmic requirements. 2 of which can be relatively cataclysmic or catastrophic, and 2 of which are relatively uniform. The most common way that we metamorphosize and grow and evolve is to, in fact, form a relationship to something that seems to symbolize to us something that we need, which in our own estimation we do not currently have. And by forming a relationship, a natural Plutonian osmosis takes place, in which we extract into ourselves that which we have formed a relationship to. And in this way we have metamorphosized the limit of our existing reality. An example of this process is that at some point in this life you have become interested in astrology. And by forming a relationship to astrology, you have osmosed into your consciousness in such a way as to metamorphosize your existing structure of reality at a mental level or a philosophical level. And thus you have evolved. The most common way that all human beings do this is to form a relationship to another human being. Because typically in our relationship formations we are attracted to an individual who seems to represent something to us which we don't have, vice versa. We form a relationship, a Plutonian osmosis takes place, and we extract into ourselves, and them, they, us, are mutual realities. Thus a metamorphosis of existing limitations in reality. For better or worse, I might add. You know, this is exactly one of the most common ways in which karma is exchanged. And this occurs in a typically Plutonian way, because in most of the intimate relationships we form, there's obviously going to be a sexual act. How many of you realize that one's karma and evolutionary background is contained in the sexual fluids? What happens when sperm and ovum unite? Through this mutual osmosis, it produces a third entity, yes? Called a baby. In a very similar way, as you osmose each other's sexual fluids, you are exchanging karma. Is it not true, as an example, for those you have slept with, that these folks or people are more deeply inside of you than those that you have not? And again, I would say for better or worse. And to me, this is the greatest argument for being sexually discriminate. That has nothing to do with religion. For those that we sleep with, we're in our own ways altering our own life path. Look at your life to understand its truth. Now happily, there is in fact a Plutonian ritual to free oneself from these effects if one wants to use it. To, in fact, in a deeper sense, to sever the karmic and biblical cord. How many would like to know this ritual?
Yes, please.
How many are too embarrassed to ask? That's what I thought. We're in Holland. In America, everybody raised their hand. And so, I will tell you because I realize most of you are simply too shy. So, it's an ancient ritual from India. It stands here now 6,000 years. And it's called Agni, A-G-N-I, which means fire. All you have to do is visualize a fire in your third eye at the Christ Center. If you can't do this yet, you make a flame candle in a dark room. And whatever images come to you, the people you're trying to be free of, you project these images into the fire until there's nothing left to project. And at the same time projecting forgiveness, not pie in the sky bullshit, but forgiveness from the point of view of accepting the responsibility in your own actions. Even if you can't see the causal factor in those actions in this life. You continue to do this until there's nothing left to project. At this point, you will feel psychically and emotionally more free, more clean, and again you will have severed the karmic umbilical cord. It is severing through the act of accepting the responsibility in your own actions. Now, if you remember the point, we normally form relationships with people that represent something to us that we need, which in our own estimation we don't have, and they us. This is one of the causal factors in the karma we call manipulation and use. Typically, especially in decades like this, people sustain their relationships only for the duration of the need that brought them into it. And once this need is satisfied, a new level of need appears, which the current partner does not seem to be able to meet. And lo and behold, Pluto would become attracted to someone else who now seems to represent this need. Boom, boom. It's exactly through this dynamic that all souls at various points in their journey have experienced violations of trust, betrayal, abandonment. And of course, the karma of manipulation and use. We all have Scorpio in our chart somewhere. We all have an 8th house, like it or not. So, now, most of the times this way of evolution is non-cataclysmic. For most of you, when you began to study astrology, it wasn't so cataclysmic, was it? So, now another way Pluto affects its evolutionary karmic requirements, and this is now going to be a form of cataclysm, is at various points the soul can become overly identified with something. This can be a person, it can be a social position, it can be a kind of reality that is no longer allowing growth. The security or the dependency linked with these situations prevents the necessary growth. And at these key moments, it creates a situation of loss. It's what I call the rug being removed from the feet. Unexpectedly, like this. And of course, this kind of loss, enforced loss, or enforced change that it upsets your whole life, can clearly be cataclysmic. And the key point, over-identification. To the point where you're not allowing yourself to grow. You're trying to desperately maintain something at all costs. Just as Nixon tried to desperately maintain his presidency, which then created emotional dishonesty and deception. Keeping in mind this man had a 10th house Pluto. Aha. Polarity point being 4th house. His whole sense of identity was linked with the social position, 10th house. And the evolutionary growth has learned to see himself completely stripped of power, Pluto. And to learn to find a new source of security, a new self-image, 4th house. And amazingly enough, when Watergate happened in the US, Pluto was exactly transiting Nixon's south node. Now, is this coincidence or synchronicity? Mm-hmm. And just like in your case, a whole past cycle for him culminated. Pluto's south node. Lifetimes of his over-identification with social position. And then clearly, Nixon did not make a conscious choice to invite impeachment. It was forced, Pluto. Another way Pluto affects its evolutionary necessities is at key points in one's journey that one can become aware of latent abilities or capacities. Latent, that which is inherent but not aware of. And at key points this becomes released out of the unconscious to the current personality. Acted upon, it generates metamorphosis of existing reality. An example, when Carter decided to run for president, Pluto was transiting his sun. And this is typically non-cataclysmic for most people. Actually, it generates a sense of excitement. The last way, which is also cataclysmic, at certain points in one's journey, in certain lives, one becomes increasingly aware, Pluto, that they're stagnating, that life seems to be stopping. They're in a rut, they're in a box, they're not growing. The sense of stagnation. Now, the awareness of stagnation does not presume the awareness of cause. They're aware of the effect, not affect. When this occurs, the consciousness will begin to naturally invert, to withdraw from the existing circumstantial reality. The intention in the withdrawal is to become aware of cause. Cause. Yes? And the withdrawal from existing circumstantial reality can become catastrophic. Why? They are progressively disengaging from their current reality, the commitments, the responsibilities, the obligations, the things they have created to this point in time. And as the disengaging or the withdrawal from these circumstances occurs and intensifies, that which they have created begins to collapse. The worst form in this situation in psychological terms is called catatonia. Catatonia. To become catatonic. Totally paralyzed in the form of consciousness, which reflects itself also in bhakti in certain cases. And we did a case a while ago, a very successful banker person, and had it all. Great rich house, happy wife, 4 kids, a Jaguar, bank credit cards, charged to the max. Great prestige. Progressively it held no meaning. He begins to withdraw. The children are going, where's Papa? The wife's going, where's my husband? The people in the bank, where's this guy working here? He's not paying bills. Pretty soon it's all gone. This is catastrophic. Now these 4 ways can interact. As an example, you may become aware of a latent capacity. And you might make the choice that, yes, I would like to actualize this. But in this choice, it might now make you aware of existing circumstances in your life that are blocking it. You see that point? These things can...
But where did Pluto was in that horoscope?
Hmm?
What did what situation?
What's the question?
You tell this story, but in what situation was Pluto, or the north or the south pole?
South Node.
South node.
Because an entire cycle is trying to culminate. And to the extent that he resisted allowing it to change, keep it in mind, Pluto does in fact again correlate to resistance to change. So really what you had in that particular case, he just didn't have the courage to change. And the only way he could change was to withdraw. Inwardly withdraw. And he finally came and saw the counselor of last resort, the astrologer. He'd seen everybody else. Nobody could explain why. Oh, look at your life, it's great, what do you do? And they were giving him the opposite advice of what he needed. So finally he staggers into the astrology office, and so we gave him some good advice. Now most of you in this room again can see these four natural ways that Pluto affects its requirements in one way or another. These are universal experiences. And again, Pluto or astrology can only reflect life. It cannot cause it. You see, this is one of the great arguments that the consensus scientist uses to invalidate astrology. And it's the basis of the argument rooted in cause and effect. Astrology is a symbolic language only. Even Moses, by the way, who was a great astrologer. You know what, a quote from Moses? Astrology is simply the symbolic language of God. What a nice way to put it. So any questions on these natural four ways?
Can I ask you something about the ritual?
Hmm?
The ritual with the fire you were talking about. Can I ask you something about that?
The Agni thing?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
It does not feel good for me to have a sort of meditation situation in which you put the images of the people that are not nice to you in a fire.
Why? Fire is a purifying element.
But also destructive.
Huh?
Destructive.
It depends on your point of view. You can use the word destruction and you're helping this person destroy perhaps negative elements in their own consciousness. And they're allowing them to purify. The operative dynamic is forgiveness. If this is the operative dynamic, tell me how something wrong can occur here. Also. Especially if you're accepting responsibility in your own actions. You're not creating blame. You're not doing something that's motivated by vindictiveness. If that's the motive, then I agree with you. And by the way, in that motive, it will come right on back. So that fire will come back to you. It all comes down to intention. This is what God judges, by the way, is our intentions, not necessarily outcomes. Now, the transit of Pluto simply reflects one's evolution. Pluto transit is somewhere in your chart now. And to understand the transit of Pluto, you simply always have to refer it. It goes all the way back to where we started. The underlying karmic evolutionary dynamic in the chart. What the soul's trying to accomplish in this life. So wherever this Pluto transit is must be related to the natal point and the polarity point, the nodal axis, when you throw in the transits of the south and north node. Wherever those transits are, because the key word in Pluto is metamorphoses. So wherever you find this transit is trying to metamorphosize some existing definition, structure, or limit in your reality. To change it, evolve it, expand it. to grow beyond it. In order to do this, sometimes the soul recreates circumstances of the past to bring them to culmination, to force the issue. Pluto transits not necessarily happy experiences. Especially when you understand the 4 ways that Pluto affects its evolutionary karmic requirements. When you're under an active Pluto transit, you generally have about a 5-year range that is operative. The intensity of the transit is condensed within 18 months. That it lies in the middle of this 5-year arc. As an example, going back to Nixon, Watergate exactly had an 18-month life. And this is when Pluto was exactly conjunct. Exactly conjunct. Nixon South Node. Wherever you find this.
And that occurs at the beginning of that 18 months period, or is it exactly in the middle of the...
It began, because I'm talking again about a 5-year range. And for Nixon, the first 4 years is when he was president for his first term. And then they began the re-election campaign. Yes? And it's right here that the Watergate thing began. Because his alter egos, he had South Node and Libra. So he had all kinds of alter egos, Halderman, Ehrlichman, yes men, that were so invested in their own need for power that they wanted to make sure he himself was re-elected. Which then became the causal factor in the Watergate break-in and all this plutonian espionage and so on and so forth. So when it finally became public, Libra, 18-month life. It's clockwork. Where you have the transiting south and north nodes, again you have to refer where the current transits of these 2 points are in your chart to your natal south node and north node, to understand what the ongoing issues are that are helping you evolve from that natal imprint. Yes? And then you have also collective application. Right now we're all going through the fact that North Node's now in Scorpio, right with Pluto, and of course the South Node's in Taurus. To understand these specific underlying issues, locate where the current planets are that rule these points. In Taurus's case, it's Venus. Venus is just now going to Aries. And at this point, Pluto stands with its own sign on North Node. You can put this in your individual chart to see exactly the contents of your immediate moments. That which is most here in your brain, right in your face. In a typical Plutonian way, you are given choices. And if most of us tend to make choices, again, that reflect our past. When we do this is exactly why the Pluto transit can be so difficult. Resistance to necessary change breeds cataclysmic events. Questions on these points? Seems perfectly clear. Painfully so.
What if transit Pluto is square to the natal nodes?
Then you're recovering something from the past. There's an element of skip steps here. And it will be directly found in the house that Pluto itself is transiting. Yeah?
And if it's trine the North Node?
Which implies sextile to South Node. Yes?
Yes, sextile South
that means that something you have to again always refer to what's come before, evolution. And this would tend to mean that the person prior to this point has made choices to support the ongoing evolution that now come into fruition. It's like a process suddenly going, aha, yep, oh, yep, mm-hmm. And now they can integrate it. It's an integration aspect. More questions? Now we get into some new material here.